That's the hope anyways. So, we've got a couple of stories to deal with tonight. Complex stories. Not really easy to comprehend in any sense of the word. I mean, with the story of Isaac, God calls on his chosen individual, Abraham, the person he's made this contract with, to sacrifice his son. And it's, how in the world are you supposed to make any sort of sensible sense out of that? It's exactly that sort of story that makes modern people who are convinced that the faster we put the biblical stories behind us, the better. It's grist for their mill, because it seems like such a incomprehensible and even barbaric act on the part of God. And so, I hesitate to even approach it, because the amount of time thinking about this over the last couple of weeks, in addition to the decades before that, is that, and all that's happened since I've been doing these biblical lectures, is that my conviction in this has been strengthened, which is quite interesting, is that if you do what it is that you're called upon to do, which is to lift your eyes up above the mundane, daily, selfish, impulsive issues that might beset you, and attempt to enter into a contractual relationship with that which you might hold in the highest regard, whatever that might be, to aim high and to make that important above all else in your life, that fortifies you against the vicissitudes of existence like nothing else can. And I truly believe that that's the most practical advice that you could possibly receive, in one that's so complex and so difficult to understand. And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham, which is a funny thing for God to do, I suppose, and said unto him, Abraham. And he said, Behold, here I am. And God said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, who thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. And Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went unto the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day of journeying, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and come again to you. It's really one of the first times that we've come across the word worship, if I remember correctly, and it's a very difficult word to contend with too. Because if you're like me, or if you're like me when I was a kid, because I haven't thought about this for a long time, it was never really obvious to me why God would want to be worshipped. You go to church and you offer up your praise and thanks to God, and you think, well, really, does that make a lot of sense? It's like, why in the world is that what he wants? It's almost like you're kneeling down in front of an ancient Middle Eastern, tyrannical emperor, and vowing your submission, and that never sat well with me, and I suppose it doesn't sit well with many people, and I think that's because it's not the proper way of conceptualizing it. Like, what happens when you see what Abraham does continually, and this seems to be implicit in the use of the word worship in this particular situation, is that, as we discussed, he has an adventure in his life that comes to an end. So there's an episode in his life, it comes to an end, and then there's a period of, you might consider it, where he reconstitutes himself to some degree. And that's when he makes his sacrifices. And it seems to me that it's that reconstitution that constitutes the worship. The worship is something like, this is alluding back to my original proposition that it's how you act that's the issue. And the worship is the decision to enact the good in whatever form it is that you can conceptualize it, as well as trying to continually reconceptualize the good in a manner that makes the good that you're conceptualizing even that much better, right? Because when you start aiming, the probability that you're going to be aiming in the right direction is very low. But hypothetically, as you aim and as you practice and as you learn, the target is going to shift in front of your eyes, and you're going to be able to follow it ever more clearly. And that seems to me, and especially given the context that this word is used in this particular story, is a much more appropriate interpretation of what constitutes proper worship. And I suppose it's akin to the later Christian idea that it's the imitation of Christ that's the sacred duty of every Christian, and every human being, I suppose, insofar as that's an archetypal idea. And the idea is something like, well, it's the embodiment of the good that's the issue. And it's not your stated belief in the good. And when Nietzsche was criticizing Christianity, this is actually one of the things that he brought up as a major issue. He said that he believed. And I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you. Now, there's an implication here too, that it's a foreshadowing that Abraham offering up his son is actually a form of worship, and that it's continuous with what he's already done. And well, now I'm going to read you some of the things that I've written, and then I'll return to this, and we'll see how that goes. So, life is suffering. That's clear. There's no more basic, irrefutable truth. It's basically, as we've seen, what God tells Adam and Eve immediately before he kicks them out of paradise. What constitutes religious? Pain and suffering define the world. Of that there can be no doubt. Sacrifice can hold pain and suffering in abeyance to a greater or lesser degree. And greater sacrifices can do that more effectively than lesser. Of that, too, there can be no doubt. Everyone holds this knowledge in their soul. Thus, the person who wishes to alleviate suffering, who wishes to rectify the flaws in being, who wishes to bring about the best of all possible futures, who wants to create heaven on earth, will make the greatest of sacrifices, of self and child, of everything that is loved, to live a life aimed at the good. He will forego expediency. He will pursue the path of ultimate meaning. And he will, in that manner, bring salvation to the ever desperate world. It appears to me. Now, I think there's more to it. I think if there has to be more to it, it lays the groundwork, at least in the Christian context, for the eventual emergence of Christ, as I alluded to in my reading. That story obviously has to be unpacked and unpacked and unpacked, just like it has been for the last 2,000 years. It's also an indication here of, well, I would say the transmutation of sacrifice into an increasingly psychological form, which is a development that we've tracked all the way through the Old Testament up to this particular point. First acted out, then represented in ritual. Those would be the rituals of sacrifice. Then laid out in story, then turned into a psychological phenomena, so that now we're capable of making sacrifices in abstraction, right? To conceptualize a future that we want, to let go of the things that are stopping us from moving forward, and to free ourselves from the chains of our original preconceptions. And that's laid out in these old stories as the optimal pathway of being, to articulate, to figure out and articulate. Right? We conjured up this remarkable idea. The future exists. We can see it even though it's only potential. We can adjust our behavior in the present in order to maximize our probability of success in the future. How best to do that? Well, the idea is something like, don't hesitate to offer the ultimate sacrifice if you want the future to turn out ultimately well. Now, obviously, that idea is clothed in metaphysical speculation and religious imagery, but it still remains an intensely practical issue, right? What is it that you could contract for, let's say, if you were willing to give up everything about you that's weak and unworthy? There's a continual hints of that in the Old Testament, right? Because what happens with Noah, of course, is that he establishes the proper covenant with God, the proper contract with being, let's say, and thrives as a consequence. And then Abraham does the same thing. There's a strong intimation that that's how the world is set right. That that idea develops and magnifies as the stories progress into something like the concept of heaven on earth. The notion being that the proper sacrificial attitude produces a psychological state and then a social state that's a manifestation of that attitude that decreases the probability that the world will careen into hell and increases the probability that people will live high quality, meaningful, private lives in a society that's balanced and capable of supporting that. And none of that seems to me to be questionable, really. I also don't think it's anything that people don't actually know. You know, people have told me many times that when they listen to me talk, they're hearing things that they already knew but didn't know how to say. It's something like that. And this is one of those things that I think is exactly like that. I mean, we can have some more questions than would be usual tonight. So, what have we established by this point? The stories that have been revealed so far are something like, they contain the idea that there's something divine that's analogous to the human capacity for communication and attention, that operates at the genesis of being itself. That's the initial account in the Old Testament. It's an account that places the role of spirit centrally in the nature of being. Now, I'm not exactly sure what to make of that, because in some ways I'm as materialistically oriented as modern people typically are. But the stories make sense to me in many ways. The idea that there's something world-creating about human consciousness, and that's akin in some sense to the divine force that called order out of chaos at the beginning of time, seems to me to be a very powerful metaphysical idea. And it also seems to me to be an idea that is immovably at the foundation of Western culture. Because our entire legal system, our society, our mutual expectations, all of that are conditioned to the final degree by our presupposition that each of us has an intrinsic value that transcends the local conditions of our being. And it's with that presupposition that we've been able to establish the society that functions, a society that functions and functions well, and that has its current characterization. And that's it's an unlikely occurrence, and it's a non-trivial reality. And I don't see any way out of that conclusion. I don't see anything that can easily be replaced with. And so God calls being into order, into being out of chaos at the beginning of time, and attributes to human beings the same essential capacity. Then we turn to Adam and Eve in the garden, and they're unconscious by all appearances, allied tightly with God, but unconscious. They don't seem aware of the future. They don't seem aware of themselves. They don't seem aware of their own vulnerability. They make the fatal error of having their eyes open. They discover their own vulnerability. They also discover their capacity for evil. We reviewed that to some degree. What's the association? Because it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the fruit of which they eat. What's the association between the discovery of vulnerability and the emergence of moral knowledge? It's something like, as far as I can tell, that you actually don't know how to be evil or to be good until you're actually aware consciously of your own vulnerability, because the essence of evil is the exploitation of vulnerability, perhaps for the sake of that exploitation. And I can't understand how to hurt someone until I know exactly how I can be hurt myself. And I can't understand how I can be hurt myself until I become cognizant of my mortal limitations, until I understand what brings me pain, until I understand the suffering that goes along with my mortal limitations, my inevitable death, and the suffering that goes along with that. And with the accrual of the knowledge of mortality and good and evil, Adam and Eve are cast out of paradise and history begins.